Based on a timeline laid out today by Premier Stephenson, Manitoba will move from public health order restrictions to recommendations on March the 15th. Prior to that, we will see some incremental changes to the public health orders, including moving the entire province to the yellow or caution level on the pandemic scale next Tuesday, February 15th, which is a week earlier than they had previously indicated. This will include things such as lifting occupancy limits for most places, both indoors and outdoors. On March the 1st, vaccine cards will be eliminated, which we can assume will mean that there will be no vaccination requirements for participation in events or entry into establishments and venues after that time. These changes, Stephenson stresses, are as a result of the data that they are receiving on decreasing ICU and hospital occupancy. She credits the majority of Manitobans who followed the health orders and got vaccinated with getting the province to this point. Earlier this year, Stephenson and Dr. Brent Roussin indicated that they expected health orders would be lifted in the spring, so this follows that predicted trajectory. We now join Premier Stephenson and Dr. Roussin for their announcement.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome here today as I welcome Dr. Roussin here with myself as we share an important update on our next steps with respect to lifting COVID-19 restrictions here in Manitoba. The past 2 years have been incredibly challenging, I think, for all Manitobans. We all have had to give up something, and some more than others. Some have lost loved ones to this virus. Others have had to isolate from family, friends, and neighbors. Businesses have had to adjust their operations, close their doors, and lay off staff. Students, teachers, and parents have had to adapt to a virtual way of learning. Our children and youth have missed out on sports, on music, on other extracurricular activities. We've had to mask up. We've had to stay apart from one another. And we've had to roll up our sleeves to get those vaccines. We've had to forego birthday parties, weddings, anniversaries, and even end-of-life celebrations. Manitobans have put their lives on hold, and it's time that we give them their lives back. I want to thank all Manitobans who have been patient and sacrificed many things in their day-to-day lives. Today, we offer hope to those who have been waiting for a long time to see that light at the end of the tunnel. The restrictions have placed many burdens on Manitobans, and now that we see the pressure of our hospital system starting to ease, it's our responsibility of government to ease those restrictions on Manitobans. With key COVID indicators improving, we are pleased to announce accelerating our plans to ease public health restrictions starting next week. Effective Tuesday, February 15th, all of Manitoba will move to yellow or caution on the pandemic response system. Effective Tuesday, March 1st, the required use of vaccine cards will be eliminated in Manitoba. And effective March 15th, mask requirements and all other restrictions will be eliminated. And for further details and other details, I will now pass it over to Dr. Roussin.
Well, thank you, Premier. Good morning, everyone. I'm Brent Roussin, Manitoba's Chief Provincial Public Health Officer. And so based on our data, on our modeling, we can see that Omicron has peaked and is beginning to subside in Manitoba. All the indicators that public health considers are moving in the right direction at this point. And so just like many times in this pandemic, we've had to shift our response based on what we're seeing with the virus. And as a result of what we're seeing now with the trends and the modeling, is we are in a very important transitional phase for our COVID-19 response here. And again, we're going to shift our approach And so this means that we can move forward with relaxing some of our public health restrictions next week, Tuesday, February 15th. So at that time, the entire province will be moving to yellow, or caution under the pandemic response system. And one of the largest changes that people will notice is that we'll be lifting many of the occupancy limits from most places, including gatherings at private residences. So this will apply in spaces like restaurants, bars, indoor-outdoor sporting events, and casinos. Capacity limits will also be removed for outdoor public gatherings, but will be limited to 50 people indoors unless proof of vaccine is required. So proof of vaccination and mask requirements are going to remain in place for the next number of weeks. However, beginning on the 15th, those aged 12 to 17 will no longer have to provide proof of vaccine or recent testing to participate in indoor sports and recreation. So we're providing more detailed information today about other changes that you'll be in place next week and to guide to your specific circumstances. So like the rest of the province, schools will be changing to yellow on the PRS. Masks will be required indoors for staff and students, but will not be required during physical education classes. Medical masks will be recommended but not required. Beginning next Tuesday, there will also be changes related to isolation requirements that start moving us from public health rules to public health recommendations, and more closely what we should be adjusting to in a typical respiratory virus season. So if you have symptoms or test positive for COVID-19, you're going to continue to be required to isolate. We want to give yourself time to feel well and isolate for the minimum of the 5 days. But close contacts will no longer be required to isolate regardless of your vaccine status. If you live with someone who has symptoms and test positive, we're going to recommend that you self-isolate, but it's no longer going to be required under a public health order. For the next several weeks, proof of vaccination will continue to be required because this is a reasonable measure that keeps us safe. We know that it's really the tremendous vaccine uptake that we've seen in Manitoba that's gotten to us to this place right now, the ability to loosen our restrictions. And so it's still, with or without proof of vaccine, it's always going to be our message to get that vaccine that you're eligible for as soon as you are eligible for it. So this is an incremental plan, and we're going to continue to move that path from public health restrictions to public health recommendations. And so for many of you, it feels like these restrictions have been in place for too long, and for others might be apprehensive about our gradual reduction in these restrictions. But we know that from the very first public health order that we have signed, these were always intended to be temporary. We knew that this pandemic would come to an end. We knew that the public health restrictions would come to an end, and we are now on that path moving forward. So we continue to have a lot of tools at our disposal. We've talked about the fundamentals in the past many times, so we know we still want people to stay home when they're ill. We still want people to get vaccinated, to wash your hands, to cover your cough and sneeze. We know that as we eventually move to public health recommendations regarding mask use, that mask use is still available to Manitobans. If you're indoors in places where you cannot distance, we'd still recommend you consider wearing a mask. Just no longer going to be a requirement at some point. We are easing the restrictions on gathering sizes, but again, we suggest Manitobans consider the size of those gatherings that they'll have based on the risks of yourself and your guests. If you are at significant risk for severe outcomes related to COVID-19, if you're in an older age group, if you have underlying medical conditions, you need to be very cautious about the number of contacts you have outside your household. But again, we're moving to those public health recommendations rather than restrictions. If you have symptoms of COVID-19, even mild, and you're at increased risk of severe outcomes, get tested as soon as possible. We now have treatments available. We have monoclonal antibodies, which have been present for some time. We have Paxlovid, the oral treatment. What we're finding now is many people who would be eligible for treatment, they are testing positive and have underlying health conditions. They're testing too late. They're presenting longer than the 5 days after symptom onset, so our medication isn't going to be useful. So if you're at increased risk of severe outcomes, get tested as soon as even the mildest symptoms start, because we do have treatment options available now. So we are certainly turning the corner in the pandemic. It wouldn't have been possible without the tremendous work and tremendous sacrifices of Manitobans, the very high level of vaccine protection. And so at this point, we are starting that path to public health advice rather than restrictions, but we're going to do so in an incremental way and continue to follow those indicators that we've been following so long. So, so thanks again to all Manitobans, and I'm going to pass it back to the Premier.
Thanks, Dr. Roussin. It's because of Manitobans' collective efforts and your dedication, your compassion, your willingness to protect one another that we are here today and able to confidently move forward to lift public health restrictions. I said several weeks ago, and you'll recall, that we must learn to live with this virus. And part, I think, of living with this virus is mitigating our own risks and doing what's best for our loved ones. I'm vaccinated. My family is fully vaccinated, and I will continue to encourage as many Manitobans to get vaccinated as possible. But the choice to get vaccinated is yours. As a government, we have encouraged as many Manitobans to get vaccinated as possible, and we will continue with those efforts. But it's time for a new normal to begin in Manitoba. We need to end the divisiveness between families, between communities. We need to move forward. It's time to bring Manitobans back together again. I think today is a good day for Manitoba, and I'm confident that we will have many more great days ahead of us. There is great hope for a positive future in Manitoba, and that hope and opportunity, I think, starts today. Thank you. Ready to take some questions.
You talked about data, and the last time here, you said the data shows we could release restrictions. And with respect, neither of you released any data. We don't see the wastewater monitoring. We don't see the absenteeism reports you're talking about. You referenced data again. Where is the data that suggests this is the proper course of action?
We'll release that data.
When?
As soon as we can.
Yeah, I think I'm going to be out at my usual media availability next Wednesday, and I'll present it there.
Sorry, we're here now, and you're announcing this now. This is the second time you've said data supports this. This is the second time you've said that, both of you, without presenting data. Why not have that now? I even gave your folks a heads up today, saying I will be asking this question.
Yeah, so we will release that data. If we can do it, we can probably do it sooner than that. Brent, I don't see any reason not to.
Dr. Roussin, did public health recommend the removal of the mask mandate, the removal of the proof of vaccination mandate on these dates?
Well, certainly we recommended the removal of all public health restrictions, the day we first issued them. We knew they're going to be temporary. So we're following, the data, and we'll release that. And we knew that all of these measures are going to be temporary. And so we had made some recommendations on what that could look like, various factors. And then looking at the data here, we've expedited by kind of a week compared to what we had before. These ones were originally going to expire on the 22nd. But from what we're seeing, we felt comfortable with moving it to this date.
But given the drain on the healthcare system and the fact that we still have ICU that is well over our normal capacity, Did you recommend these changes on these dates?
Well, we recommend, we work with the healthcare system where we're in instant command, so we meet daily with that system, looking at that very capacity, looking at what our modeling tells us in the direction of it. So yes, we are recommending that incremental release of these. Again, cautiously, right? We're not doing it overnight. We're watching it, and at each step, we're going to continue to watch those indicators, remembering that the incubation period of Omicron is much shorter than some of those other strains. So that 2-week period gives us a number of incubation periods to watch.
Madam Premier, how much of this is political? People are going to look at this timeline that has been moved up and say that you're giving into the pressures of the protesters that are sitting outside the legislative building right now.
Not at all. What I would say is that this has been ongoing. I mean, Dr. Rusin said, I guess weeks ago, that we were looking at probably the spring wherein we would be removing all the restrictions. And that was before protesters were out in, the front of the legislature. So, I mean, we have been having these discussions for some time. We've been following the data. The data is now telling us that the ICUs are on decline. The ICU capacity for COVID patients is on decline. The hospitalization capacity is on decline. So now it's time to, I think, safely move forward with the reduction of these restrictions. I think, today is about all Manitobans, and all Manitobans who are tired of this pandemic, who want to move on, who want to get their lives back. This is a day for all Manitobans.
What do you say to the protesters outside? We're seeing Doug Ford in Ontario today issuing a state of emergency. We have our borders that are blocked here at Emerson. We have people that are not leaving outside, that are planning another protest outside Boundary Trails Hospital on Saturday.
Yeah, what I would say, I have reached out to the Prime Minister, and I've asked for what is the plan and his plan moving forward to deal with this. It's nothing that's unique to Manitoba. Obviously, we're seeing it across the country. There needs to be some sort of a plan on the part of the federal government to ensure that we can have the movement of goods across our border, and that's not curtailed in any way. So I have reached out to him. I think he needs to reach out to President Biden as well, and look at some sort of a collaborative approach to this. It's happening on both sides of the border. And so we've done that. I have reached out to Governor Burgum as well of North Dakota. I will be having a conversation with him this afternoon to see how we can work together. And when it comes to the protests that are just outside the grounds of the legislature, it's obviously in the purview of the Winnipeg police, and I have been in touch with the mayor. And we will have ongoing discussions on that as well to ensure that we're taking a collaborative approach to this.
With respect, Madam Premier, I got this
protest movement at all. They've asked to meet with you. Have you or Minister Gertsen or Minister Friesen, who are representatives of the Southern Health Region where a lot of the protesters are from, have any of you reached out to meet with any of the protest organizers?
So I did receive a letter, I believe it was on Tuesday, from the protesters outside the legislative grounds. Obviously, we've been, occupied with other things here, looking at modeling, looking at the data to ensure that we can, safely put together a plan that to safely reopen Manitoba. And so I think, that's what we have been doing. Having said that, I'm not saying that I would never meet with them. It's just that, there's a lot of demands on all of our times. And I think what's important is that, and I want to thank actually the Winnipeg Police Service for the incredible work that they're doing, working with the protesters to ensure that things don't escalate to a point, that it's dangerous. And if it does, then we'll have to take some action, and we'll certainly work with the mayor and others out there. Of course, the Winnipeg Police falls under the city's purview, but we're working collaboratively, I think,
Madam
on
Premier,
this.
We are seeing widening protests across the country, here in Manitoba as well. Some with a hard right element that is, let's face it, are not here about vaccine mandates. People in every corner of Canada are disappointed at every level of government, instead of taking action, is pointing the fingers at the others, saying, well, no, it's their responsibility. You were just asked the question. You pointed to Trudeau, you pointed to Bowman. What are you going to do as the leader of this province to ensure that our economy is safe and that the goods and services flow? What are you going to do?
Well, I think finished saying what I have done. And, I think this has to be a collaborative approach to this. I mean, some of these protests are taking part at the border as a result of something that the Prime Minister of our country implemented. It's not something that's unique to Manitoba, but I haven't walked away from that. I mean, I am working with them. I'm reaching out to the Governor of North Dakota. I'm working with the Mayor, and we're going to work in a collaborative way through this.
Do you recognize that far-right extremists are involved in this?
With respect, to what's happening outside the legislative grounds, I think it's important to let the professionals do their jobs. That's the Winnipeg Police, and I think we need to have respect for what they are doing to ensure that it doesn't escalate. And that's what their job is, and they're doing an amazing job.
I'm not
But
talking
we saw
about the
a school
protests
targeted
here.
yesterday, and we're seeing a hospital that's going to be targeted on Saturday. What are you guys doing to stop that?
So, listen, people have the right to, peaceful protests in our country. That's part of being a democratic society. And, but there needs to be balance, and there shouldn't be, people protesting in front of schools and hospitals and those places. And certainly, we did reach out. I know the Minister of Education and I, reached out yesterday to ensure that, this doesn't get to a dangerous situation. And, we need to make sure that we work with the professionals, the officers who are trained to deal with these situations so that they don't escalate to levels where it's beyond control. And so I just want to thank all those officers for the incredible work they're doing to ensure that we don't get to that phase.
We're going to jump to Zoom now.
Now go to the Zoom call with reporters who will have one preliminary and one follow-up question. Up first this morning from the Brandon Sun, Kyle.
Good morning. Premier, you started off by talking about all the sacrifices that Manitobans have made throughout this pandemic. Are you concerned at all that by taking us out of these restrictions, perhaps prematurely, that you'll be subjecting us to more hardship in the future if we have to, go back into harsher restrictions due to a new variant, or if the pandemic takes a nasty turn?
Well, thanks for the question, Kyle. And of course, we're making these decisions and developing these plans based on the data and the modeling that we've seen. And so we'll continue to move in that direction. These restrictions were never put in place to be there permanently. And I think Manitobans have sacrificed a lot in their lives. Many Manitobans haven't been able to see their loved ones. Children have been away from school at times. They've been away from their sporting events. These are not easy decisions that have been made in the past, but they were necessary to protect Manitobans. Now it's an opportunity to move beyond that. And based on what we're seeing, I think we're very confident that this plan is put in place, with incremental timelines. It's a plan for Manitobans so that they can plan for their future as well. So I think it's time for that.
All right, thank you. And have you guys of instituting a state of emergency similar to what Doug Ford over in Ontario announced this morning?
So, again, I would go back. The RCMP is monitoring the situation along with the border patrol people, and I think we need to let the professionals do their jobs. I know that they have been in touch with the protesters. They have now identified someone who is in charge of the protest at the border, and I think we need to let the professionals do their jobs. When it comes to this, they are trained to de-escalate situations, and I know with in my previous time as the Minister of Justice, I worked with those law enforcement officers, the RCMP, the Winnipeg Police Service, and they do incredible work to ensure they continue with the safety of Manitobans. So we thank them for their work.
Thank you.
From CJOB, Clay.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Hi, Clay.
All right. Dr. Rusin, we all know Omicron is quite contagious. Are you worried that these restrictions, a number of the restrictions being lifted, could cause a lot of people to let their guard down?
Yeah, and so what we see right now is that there's been a significant amount of transmission that has already occurred due to Omicron, and that wave has now peaked based on the amount of Manitobans that have been infected, as well as our very high vaccine rates. So the modeling that we're looking at, what we see has occurred in other jurisdictions. This is the appropriate time now to begin easing some of our restrictions, but of course following those indicators that we always do. That's why we're doing it in a stepwise manner. But based on what we're seeing here and in other jurisdictions, this is that appropriate time to start easing our restrictions.
Premier, is it your hope that easing some of these restrictions are going to end these protests?
Well, I think what this does is easing some of these restrictions is giving Manitobans more freedom in their lives. And I think that they have sacrificed a lot in their lives over the last couple of years, and I think many Manitobans have been waiting for this for some time, and I think this is about giving that hope and opportunity back to Manitobans again.
From CBC Radio Canada, Alexia.
Hi, can you maybe, I would like to know if the government intends to continue to have this extra capacity for ICU or return to pre-pandemic numbers of beds.
So I believe Minister Gordon will be going out along with Dr. David Mateer this afternoon to have indicate what is happening with respect to the ICU capacity moving forward with respect to surgery and diagnostic procedures. So I know that she'll have more Minister Gordon will have more to offer, and Dr. Mateer this afternoon on those issues.
Thank you. And will you look at the situation in Alberta and Saskatchewan after they ease their own restriction to maybe adjust hours based on their results?
So every province makes their own decisions based on the data that they have, and I'll ask Dr. Rusin to jump in here if he'd like as well. But we make our decisions based on the data and the modeling that we see here in Manitoba. Sometimes we look to other provinces to see if there's trends that we can learn from here, and if there are trends we can learn from, we can act on those. So those are always opportunities for us as we move forward.
From CTV Winnipeg, Michelle.
Hi, I just would like for you to tell us what are the benefits as well as drawbacks to accelerating lifting restrictions like this?
So I think when it comes to the acceleration of these restrictions, we make that decision, as Dr. Rusin said earlier, based on the modeling and the data that we see. And what we have seen is a fairly significant decrease in ICU, COVID-related ICU, and as well as hospitalization, COVID-related hospitalizations. And so we believe that because Manitobans have really sacrificed a lot in their lives, that as the hospitalizations start to ease, that we need to ease some restrictions for Manitobans as well, so that they can get back to living their lives in some semblance of normalcy.
Okay, so what thresholds are going to be used potentially if we need to bring these restrictions back? Because people aren't going to want them once they're gone.
So we continue to look at the modeling, and we're making these decisions based on the modeling that we see. I think that, I'd ask maybe Dr. Rusin to jump in here and make his comments on this. But we make our decisions based on the information that we have and the time, and we're very confident, I think, moving forward with this plan that Omicron is different from Delta, from other variants, and I think what we're seeing is that we're in a situation where we're confident that we can move forward with this sort of cautious and measured approach to easing of the restrictions. Some provinces have chosen to go much more quickly. We have taken what I think is a cautious and measured approach, and so that's what we see before us today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so certainly we've done this before. We've loosened restrictions. Restrictions have never been what we've interpreted to be permanent. And then at times we've had to reinstate them. So I don't think anyone really wants restrictions in place, but when they were required in the past, we've loosened them when appropriate and added them back on if necessary. What we've seen now is that we have such a tremendously high vaccine uptake. The thought is that we're at a point where we can look to remove these restrictions outright and hope never to have to put them in again. But that's going to depend on what we see with the virus. Further variants are certainly not out of the question, and we'll have to deal with that as that arises. But we're not going to leave restrictions in unnecessarily just because there may be a time where we face this virus again.
From City News, Mike.
Hi, Premier. I know you were asked this already, but the timeline of pulling this press conference together, it does seem coincidental. 2 days ago, the new restrictions kicked in. The city just met to discuss these protests. Are you telling Manitobans who are going to be questioning this that it's purely coincidental that the timeline was accelerated as the protests continued?
Look, as a government, we don't make decisions that are this important to Manitobans based on protests that are taking place. This was not a decision that was made because of what's going on and protests that are taking place in the province. This is a decision that is made for Manitobans who have sacrificed much of their lives for the last 2 years and are ready for this. Manitobans are ready to get their lives back, and that's what today is all about.
Thank you. And my follow-up question is, you commended police for their work on this protest. Manitobans in the downtown area probably would think differently. There have been reports of verbal assaults, horns going off at all times of the night, people losing sleep, people who work night shifts losing sleep during the day. Can you just tell me exactly what you're commending police for, and if you think this protest should have been handled any differently?
So I commend the police for the work, the ongoing work that they do to ensure that things don't get out of hand and escalate to a point where, it's dangerous for individuals. But we need to have a balanced, respect for one another here. There needs to be respect for the rights of those individuals to protest in as long as it's in a, law-abiding way. And we ask for them to also, respect those people who are living in the vicinity and maybe think about those people as well and ensure that those people have the right to, live peacefully in their homes as well and not be disturbed in the middle of the night. And I think those are discussions that are taking place as a result of discussions between the Winnipeg Police and those who are organizing the protest. I think, there was sort of an organized approach to that did happen as a result of those discussions with the professionals, with the police officers who are trained in this. And so, there needs to be respect on both sides of this for the rights of those individuals.
From CBC National News, Cameron.
Hi, Premier. On that point, we've been hearing from people around these protests, whether it's the protests downtown, the truckers at the border that can't get across the border, or people that have been held up by the slow rolling, that their rights have been infringed. And they've been infringed now for a long time. If you don't have the legal authority here, you have moral authority. Are you willing to use your moral authority to call for an end to the protests?
So again, I mean, I have reached out to the Prime Minister. It is his purview, under his purview, the border. And so, you know, I've asked what is the plan to deal with this. We know that it's nothing that's unique just to Manitoba, but it is happening across the country. Of course, we respect the RCMP officers who are managing the situation at the border. They are the professionals here who are ensuring that I believe livestock is able to get through, that there are some truckers that are able to get through. But again, it goes to both sides. There needs to be a balance, a respect for those you know, who have the right to peaceful protest, but also those truckers who have the right to deliver those services as part of their job. And so, you know, I have reached out also to the governor of North Dakota. I will be having a discussion with him this afternoon just to see what's happening on their side of the border as well. Of course, those you know, restrictions at the border were put in place as a result of President Biden putting those in place, and so I look forward to having those discussions. So we are, and I am acting on this.
People have been honking their horns at all hours outside of your office. People that live around it are sick of it. Is it not time to tell them to go home and follow the lead of other politicians in this country, including Doug Ford and now the interim Conservative leader? Has the point not been made, Premier?
I think they have made their point. There's no question. I think their point is loud and clear. But again, we need to let the professionals do their jobs to ensure that things don't escalate to a point where they get out of hand. And so I take the advice of those professionals, being the police officers who are there at the front lines, who are gauging what the temperature of the situation is on a minute-by-minute and hour-by-hour basis, and making decisions, you know, that are in the best interest of Manitobans. I mean, but, you know, I will ask those protesters out there to please consider, you know, the livelihoods and the rights of those individuals who are living and working in downtown Winnipeg in close proximity to their protests. Think about those individuals and what it means to them, because they have rights here too.
From the Verdun Empire Advance, Anne. Hello, Anne.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, Anne.
Hi, yes, it's great to be on this call. Thank you. I guess I have watched from a distance, of course, this protest, watched some CBC footage and some Global and CTV, as well as citizen footage, some various smaller media as well. Why do you think, Premier, that this protest has grown so broad? What has brought it to this level? And how effective do you think it would be for our federal leader, Justin Trudeau, to come and speak to them, or for you yourself at our legislature to come out and address these people and do some mediation that way?
Yeah, I think, you know, again, I think people have the right to peaceful protests as long as that's what is happening and continues to happen. I think in other jurisdictions that is maybe not happening right now, and again, those professionals, the officers who are working, you know, right there at the front lines are best to gauge the situation that's happening, you know, right there and right then, and they will monitor those, and we continue, and we're in close contact. I know the Minister of Justice was out yesterday answering some of these questions. I know he's working diligently, his department, and working with law enforcement to gauge, you know, where that's at, and I think we'll just continue to monitor the situation.
Thank you. It's good to hear from you. I'm wondering, do you have confidence in Manitobans to now take health seriously and to manage throughout a flu season or a pandemic of this level? I mean, people are not dropping dead all around us. Have we got the wherewithal to just stay home and respect, behave ourselves and go forward as the mandates are done.
Thanks, Anne. Listen, I have every confidence in Manitobans to manage their own health and to gauge what they believe is best for themselves and their families. And, and that's why I think the vast majority of Manitobans went out and got vaccinated. We had a very successful vaccination campaign here in Manitoba. And I think that, again, I think Manitobans are getting a little bit tired of the restrictions. I believe that they want to move on. I think they want to get their lives back, or some semblance of normalcy back into their lives. And of course, that's what we're here to do and announce today, and to give them their lives back.
We now return to the news conference theater.
The virus is still in the province. You're lifting mask mandates in personal care homes as well in March. What are you going to be doing to keep vulnerable people like those in care homes still safe, given that COVID is still out there?
Yeah, well, for the higher risk settings like personal care homes, like healthcare settings, we're going to be working with the infection prevention control experts there. So just like at other times in the pandemic, there may be added requirements in those settings. So masks may still be required in healthcare settings and personal care homes, for instance. So there's still more to come on that.
Will vaccination and testing still be required in those settings for people who work there?
So again, we're not going to do anything unilaterally. We're going to work with those settings, but the idea, right, as moving forward, is that we are moving away from vaccine mandates. And so that is the path we're taking. When that exactly will affect those areas, we haven't come to that yet.
Dr. Are you comfortable with these changes that you've announced today, given the fact that the healthcare system really hasn't had a chance to have a breath? I know new admissions are dropping, but there's still people in those beds. ICU capacity is still well over the pre-pandemic normal. Why are these restrictions being eliminated in the coming weeks when the healthcare system is still not catching its breath?
Yeah, so I mean, there certainly is that strained healthcare system. It's come down from what we've seen in other settings. But again, if we frame things like that, we're eliminating what we know are tremendous negative impacts of the restrictions as well. So we always have to find that balance, right? So we've probably all know people who have been adversely affected by these restrictions. So we can't just focus on one aspect of the pandemic. We know the restrictions cause harm. We know that the healthcare system has been strained. We're looking for that balance, but we have to consider the adverse effects of these restrictions and do whatever we can to have the least restrictive measures in place.
Madam Premier, when I asked about extremism, I wasn't talking about this protest out here. This protest out here is cooperating with the police and has largely been in one place. But we are seeing widening protests at the border, in Steinbach, in other provinces. I'm going to ask you again, how concerned are you about a far-right, hard-right element doing things to undermine democracy in general in this country?
Well, Bartley, I mean, what I would say is that every protest is different, and if something starts to escalate to a point where people are doing things unlawfully, then we need to step in, absolutely. And we will monitor that as it goes forward. But I'm not going to give a sweeping statement about something that isn't reality that could potentially happen in the future. What we're seeing here is, and you just said yourself, what we are seeing is that the police are doing a very good job out here.
This protest. I was talking about the ones we're seeing at the border in this province, at the border in other provinces, surrounding and harassing schools, and the encampment away from the main one in Ottawa down there. We are seeing extremists at work here whose goal appears to be something far beyond vaccine mandates and pandemic restrictions. I'm just curious why you don't seem to be willing to acknowledge that.
I don't condone any illegal activity anywhere.
So you'll be cool if climate change or Indigenous protesters block the border in the future? You'd have the same approach?
I think if things get violent and they're not being handled appropriately, and again, I would rely on the professionals within those individual protests to see, what the situation is there. They are the ones that know how to appropriately de-escalate situations to ensure that people can protest in a peaceful way. And so I've said that time and time again, and I think I've answered that question.
Premier, what does the lifting of restrictions mean for those who had to either get vaccinated or get tested for work, like some healthcare workers? Is that going to be removed now as well?
Sorry, what's that?
The people who had to either follow a vaccine mandate or get tested to work, such as some healthcare professionals, is that going to be lifted as well? Will people be able to go back if they are not vaccinated without having to be tested?
Yeah, those details will be ironed out through the course of the next little while, but eventually, and what I've said weeks ago, is that, you know, and other professionals or other, you know, doctors and other politicians across the country have also said that we need to learn to live with this. And so what does that look like moving forward? We'll gauge those circumstances, but eventually we'll have to learn to live with this, where we're not imposing, you know, unnecessary restrictions because of one virus that's in the community. There's all sorts of other illnesses that we need to ensure that we're ready for, that our hospitals are ready for, and so we'll continue to gauge that as we move forward.
But that's not part of these, sorry, I just want to be clear, it's not part of these timelines yet. So as of March 15th, healthcare professionals will still either have to be vaccinated or get tested to go to work?
No, I believe that will be lifted, but we'll have those.
Didn't you answer that question about vax requirements for people working with the vulnerable sector, and you said we're going to look at that?
So we're still certainly the path we're on is to lift vaccine mandates. So this is speaking about the ones in the public sector where we are. Right. If we're looking at the in those test or vaccine requirements, again, we're probably looking at similar timelines on that, but it's just not settled on right now.
And why not create a state of emergency? Why not? Brittany asked, you didn't quite answer that one. Forgive me.
Because again, we are continuing to monitor the situation as it comes about at the border and at the legislature, and you know, if we have to take action, we will. But for right now, the RCMP are doing their jobs very well to ensure that things don't escalate beyond where they need to be. Thanks, everyone.
You know, I want to reflect a little bit on the U.S. border and the disturbances going on there at Pembina. So I've had the opportunity for the last almost a decade, I think, to co-chair the Canada-U.S. Relations Committee. It's a committee of the Council of State Governments Midwest branch. And so I currently chair with the Speaker of the House of Ohio, Senator Robert, reached out to for a conversation in addition to Minister Mendichenko, Public Safety Minister, to speak about some of the things that are happening at the border. But I've learned in the last 10 years as co-chair of that committee how incredibly important those border crossings are. And the goods that move across, the jobs that are related to that, how important it is to Manitoba and to Manitobans. And we can't underestimate that we need goods moving across. One of the things about this pandemic is that even though there's been disruption when it comes to non-business travel, 95 to 98% of the traffic over the pandemic is maintained for commercial traffic, and that's been one of the great successes of the Canada-U.S. Business relationship, because we're not just friends and allies, we're partners, but we trade together because we build things together, and those lines have to remain open. With that in mind, you know, I recognize the frustration and challenges that those who are at the border are, and why they're demonstrating. In some ways, I'm not trying to minimize frustration that people have, but I also understand that there are others who are impacted and others who are, not the least of which are truckers, who rely on getting across that border. My dad was a trucker for Penner International and Steinbach, so I spent some time in those big rigs, and I've got a lot of appreciation for the work that they do, but they have to get across the border. In my conversation, hopefully soon with Minister Mendichenko, I will reemphasize the importance of that accessibility, calling upon the Trudeau government to do what it can to lower the temperature, to ensure that people are being heard, to work respectively to resolutions, not just at the Pembina border, but at all the border crossings across Canada, not the least of which would be, the Windsor border crossing, the most trafficked one when it comes to commercial trade. This needs to be resolved, and it needs to be resolved with a federal government that is willing to engage with people to try to come to a resolution. So I'm hopeful that the federal government will do that. This is an international border, and so it falls to their responsibility, and can't have any more of the divisiveness when it comes to some of the rhetoric. We have to bring that down, and ensure that we're listening to people. Not always in agreement. We're not always going to agree, and that's okay. But I think we have to sometimes understand where other people are coming from in different positions. You can be working in an ICU. And wonder why there aren't more restrictions, and maybe think about those businesses that have been closed. Until those businesses that have been closed, those owners I know sometimes think about the challenges in the hospital. Not always have to agree with each other, but if we can put ourselves into the shoes of somebody else and try to understand why they're feeling the way they feel, that'd be helpful. So I really hope that we can get the federal government to engage in that. I would say to those who are protesting at the border that it's a lot of your residents, your fellow Manitobans, some of whom might very well agree. Many, I'm sure, who very well agree with some of what your cause is. Our government, early on when the vaccine mandates came for the borders, indicated that we asked the Trudeau government to look at a different path. In Manitoba, we didn't require vaccination for a lot of occupations. We offered options. We asked the Trudeau government to look at another path. But now those who are protesting at the border, they're having an impact. I've heard from certainly many of my constituents I know will support these causes, but I've also heard from constituents who've said we need to get across the border, who own trucking companies. And so, I hope that they'll consider that as well. I understand that there's some movement when it comes to livestock and that, and so that's appreciated, but it's important that we keep lanes open at the border. For Manitobans overall, everybody's tired of saying it and everybody's tired of hearing it about how difficult it is, but it is difficult. But I do think we're going to be in a better place soon. We've gone through challenging times. We need to not only respect each other, but try to understand the positions of each other. Don't have to agree with those positions, but try to understand where people are coming from. That'll help, I think, a little bit in terms of the language and the rhetoric that is sometimes put out there. A little bit of understanding about where it's at. Premier and Dr. Roussin will be out tomorrow to talk about health orders. As you know, they're coming up for renewal. Dr. Roussin talked about targets that he had in terms of lifting restrictions and updates, and they will provide you an update on the further loosening of restrictions, and those announcements will come tomorrow. So, I know that there's a lot of people who are in challenging times. Police have been, Winnipeg Police in particular, I know, have been having negotiations and discussions with those who are protesting outside of this building. Lots of strong feelings, lots of strong emotions. I hear it from Manitobans who have all sorts of different perspectives. I appreciate that communication has resulted in some things, like I understand less honking of the horns, because people live nearby here, and those of you in the media, this area well. There's a lot of people who live in close proximity. You might be some of them, and I'm glad, from what I understand, is that that discussion has resulted in a bit more of a civil procedure, so that people aren't so disturbed for those who live nearby in this area. And then they continue to have discussions about access of the roads. And so we're grateful for the lines of communication that remain open. I think that is important. It is a respectful and democratic right to protest and to have differences of views. But there are other rights that also have to be protected, and those who live nearby, who get to work, we have to respect their rights as well. So challenging times, I know, for Manitobans. I'm calling on Manitobans to step back, think about the reasons that other people feel differently than you do. I'm not necessarily asking you to change your mind. I'm asking you to just consider why other people feel the way they do. And I think that'll get us to a better place in terms of how we respond to each other. And that starts with the federal government and Mr. Stepping back and having some respectful and looking for a reasonable path forward for all of us through this time, and to ensure that those borders remain open. With that, I'm happy to take the questions in the room and any that are on the phone as well.
You're calling on the federal government to be more understanding, and you're calling on both sides, as it were, to be more understanding. But only one side is occupying a street in Winnipeg. Only one side is blocking border traffic. Only one side has surrounded a school in your constituency today.
Which is different, Steve, than saying that those actions are correct. I don't think that we should be saying that the blocking of an international border is the right action. I don't think that that is the right action. I want those lanes open. I want to ensure that here in the city of Winnipeg, that people can live and work in a reasonable way, and they have the right to live and work in a reasonable way. But I do think overall that everyone has to take a bit of a step back, a little bit of a step back, and go, why is it that people feel the way they do? I don't agree with them. I don't agree with blocking in a border and not allowing truckers to be able to cross into the United States. I don't agree with that. But I do think that all of us have to bring the temperature down a little bit before we get to a better place of understanding.
What is the government going to do to open the border, to end the occupation of the street out front of the legislature, to end the blockade of the entrance to the legislature grounds that has gone on for almost a week now?
So there's a number of things that that are difficult for the government to do, and you understand why, Steve. When it comes to the police. Governments, whether it's the city of Winnipeg, who is responsible for the city of Winnipeg police, or the federal government, frankly, when it comes to the RCMP, and I know it's a joint operation between the RCMP and Canadian Border Services at the border. They can't direct operations, and you know that, you know why that is. And there are times, I'm sure, that there are people today who would say, well, you should direct the police, and that might feel good today, depending on which side of this debate that you're on. But in the long run, having politicians direct police operations is not the right place to be in a democratic society. So we've continued to provide the resources that have been asked of us as a provincial government. Where there are resources that are required, we'll continue to engage with the federal government on what's going on at the international border, which is primarily a federal responsibility. And I am encouraged by the Winnipeg Police Service's dialogue that continues on with what's happening up front. But it can't go on forever. And so, there are obviously different options that will always be looked at and considered. But at this point, I think that, that dialogue that's happening will continue, and the police service has been engaged in that with some success, but not without some frustration, Steve. There are a lot of people who are frustrated about a lot of things. And I get that. I'm not going to solve everybody's frustration, but I think that we get to a place that's better by taking a few steps back and just dialing down the rhetoric a little bit.
Jason, are you calling on the truckers outside the legislature to go home?
I think my preference, of course, would be that they not be blocking roadways, that they not be honking and keeping people up at night. I think that there's been some advances for that to happen, but I also respect the right of people to peacefully protest, which is different than an occupation, of course. And we have seen many people protest here at the legislature. Some who have stayed a while, but these things do have to end. So I'm encouraged by some of the discussions that I've heard happen between the Winnipeg Police Service and those who are involved in the protest. But it can't go on forever. I think that a point has been made. I think that their point has been heard, and I think that there's going to come a time when absolutely we have to move on from this. And I don't just mean when it comes from the protests. I mean, there's a lot of things we have to move on from in society. But I think that their point's been heard, and I hope that they'll continue to have that dialogue with the Winnipeg Police Service about keep those roads open, give access to people who need access, allow people to be able to sleep at night, and I think there's been some advancements there, and I'm hopeful for more.
Are there resources within the province that you can tap into? The motor vehicle branch or the ag department? I mean, there's farm equipment out there. Is there anything more the province can do in terms of enforcement?
We're looking at it. We're looking at what the options are and what might be available. Obviously, this is a unique situation, and you need to ensure that you're applying it correctly. Anything that you do apply at this stage, we think that the operational side that's happening from the Winnipeg Police Service and the discussions that are happening with them is the right approach, and we'll leave the operations to them, but we're always looking at options should they be needed.
Protest outside the legislative building is lawful?
Well, everybody's going to get into a debate about blocking a road is illegal, and yet we also know that in a society that's a democratic society that values both the spirit and the letter of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, that there is the opportunity for people to express unhappiness with the government. And so, trying to find that balance sometimes moves in between the law and the spirit of the Charter. So ultimately, by the letter of the law, I think you'll find that most protests in some form or fashion end up breaking certain bylaws or laws, but in a democratic society, we typically see that the right to be able to express concerns about government is an important freedom. So it's never black and white. I think every protest or demonstration will have some challenges when it comes to that line. This one is clearly it in terms of challenges, but I think right now the right way is to continue those discussions.
Previously, the Premier said that the concerns that the protesters had merit. I'm wondering if that's still the position of the government, and if you think that the province's silence on the protests to date has encouraged the actions, including the blockade at the border.
I think if I recall, the Premier's comments were in relation to the vaccine mandate that was originally posed by the Trudeau government and has been reciprocated in the United States as well. And so our view was that, look, we had a lot of people at some points who said there should be mandatory vaccination when it came to healthcare workers or education workers. Our view was, and I agreed with it, that there should be some options. Those options included testing. Not everybody likes the testing option either, but it's different than a mandatory vaccination. And so those were the concerns that were raised, I think, by the truckers originally. I think it's probably morphed and changed a little bit in terms of some of the concerns, but the original concerns when it came to the vaccine mandate across the border, I think should have been considered more by the federal government, looked at what some of the evidence was, and to see whether or not there were other paths forward.
Do you think that the government's relative silence around the protests has encouraged the demonstrators and encouraged the blockade at the border?
Well, so I think relative silence is a relative word, and I hear from some folks who say, well, you're always speaking, against the protest, but there are lots of protests that happen. And I hear from others who might say, well, you're not saying enough about it. I think what we've tried to do is try to encourage dialogue as much as we can without giving direction between the law enforcement and those officials who are engaged with the operational decisions, but then to also say to those who are protesting, and I've said this many times, that we do respect a person's right to demonstrate against the government, but understand that there are those around you who also have rights, the right to sleep in your apartment, the right to be able to access, get to work on roadways. Same thing at the U.S. border. People have a right to demonstrate, but there are truckers who are trying to earn a living and trying to get across that border, and consumers who are relying on that. So I know people don't like to hear that, there's you kind of take some balances to these things. But balance obviously sometimes gets you to a solution. You rarely get to a solution where everybody says that this has to be entirely my solution and there can't be any other sort of consideration of anything else. We're going to have to bring down some of the rhetoric and try to ensure that that we have some sense of what is a better way forward.
We're going to turn to Zoom now.
Thank you. A reminder to our reporters on this Zoom call, you will have one preliminary and one follow-up question. Up first this afternoon from CJOB, Skylar.
Hi, Mr. Gertson. Sorry, I couldn't find the mute button there. I understand in regards to the protest at the Emerson border crossing that you're hoping the federal government will take action, but there have been several incidents on Manitoba's highways over the last week or so, most notably the one on Highway 3 that prevented an elderly lady from getting timely medical care. I'm just wondering what the province is going to do to make sure those situations don't happen again.
Yeah, and I know that the RCMP spoke out in particular about that incident, and I want to say that there are, and I'll say it again, and probably you'll get tired of hearing it. There is a democratic right to demonstrate against government. That is an expression of freedom, and we don't want to lose that expression of freedom ever in the society that we live in. But countering that and balancing that are the rights of others, the right to be able to get to a hospital when you need medical treatment, the right to be able to live in your home in peace. Those have to also be considered. And so I would say to those who are demonstrating and are demonstrating in ways that involve slow rolling or whatever they call it on highways, be very, very mindful of where you are in terms of hospitals, in terms of other emergency vehicles, in terms of others who are signaling that they need to move through because they might have some sort of an emergency. We don't want to see those consequences as a result of the right to protest. We have to be mindful of others as well. So I know the RCMP. I think they put something out on social media regarding that and their concerns, and I know that they'll take it seriously. And I would ask those who are demonstrating to be mindful of those things as well.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And then I guess just further to that, in your constituency, as Steve pointed out, the high school in Steinbach today believed that the protest outside was a threat enough that they had to go into a hold and secure situation. Just wondering what your message is to those protesters. Obviously, there was quite a student component there too, but there were adults from the community taking part, and there is a daycare in that school as well. It's not just high school kids inside.
It's the same message, right? That it's been tough for school kids. My son is in school, and it's been a tough couple of years. And so I understand from a student's perspective, hearing his perspective, and from a parent's perspective, being a parent. But there are appropriate places, I think, to provide demonstration as adults now as students. I mean, while I might not agree, I don't know what all the cause was. I haven't heard all the details, but I may or may not agree with protests that happen with students at different times. And we've seen demonstrations and climate change and different reasons why students act out in a school in a certain way to demonstrate that they're concerned about something. But for those adults who are involved, I think it's important to remember that schools, hospitals, there are certain places that really aren't the appropriate place for those demonstrations, and I think we have to be mindful of those places because there are unique things happening there. There are more vulnerable populations sometimes, and it goes back to my original message that you may have a very strong view about something. And I don't know what all the demonstration was about at the SRSS school that I graduated from, but please just try to take some perspective of other people and what some of your actions are doing. And not saying that you shouldn't protest or shouldn't demonstrate against government. I have many of my constituents who are concerned about the actions of government. I hear from them all the time. And that is fair and appropriate in a democratic society, but just be mindful of the impact that you're having on others as well in the short term and the long term.
From the Winnipeg Sun, Ryan.
No, can't hear me. Hi. Mr. Goertzen, you said we have to take the temperature down a bit. What do you mean by that? Can you explain a bit more on what you mean when you say that?
Kind of mean everybody. You know, like I mentioned specifically the Prime Minister, and you know, I've heard some words I think that are sometimes unnecessarily divisive when it comes to speaking about people. And I don't, my Prime Minister and I will, I'm sure, agree on some things and disagree on a lot of things. But how we say things is really, really important. It's really hard to have dialogue with anybody when the first thing you try to do is you know, try to classify them as you know, less Canadian or something else. And you know, I've seen a lot of that in the last 2 years, where people are arguing a position not based on what they believe in terms of how something should happen, but how they think about another person, and try to downgrade an individual or cast aspersions on an individual because they don't agree with their position. And that leads us to a place like we are today, where it's very, very difficult to talk to each other. And it's really, really difficult to come to some kind of a resolution or understanding. People may not believe it, but we will, find our way to the other side of this pandemic, and we're going to have to live with each other again. And I think how we usually did that is Manitobans is by disagreeing on lots of things, but not necessarily assuming that because you disagree with a person that the other person's a bad person. Just because another person doesn't have the same view that you have doesn't mean that they're a bad person. You might believe that they're behaving badly, but that's different. So I'm asking people to bring down the temperature by simply doing what Manitobans almost always do, and that is to be respectful of each other, even in disagreement. And I would say the same thing to the Prime Minister. He's the leader of the country. He is the Prime Minister. He sets the tone. It's very, very important, even in disagreement, that he understand that he is still the Prime Minister for all Canadians. Try to find a way through this border impasse that has tremendous implications for us from an economic perspective and for Canadians. So it's an easy thing to do. I'm not trying to be Pollyannic about this, but it is his responsibility as the Prime Minister.
Okay, and you mentioned too that the protesters kind of they've been heard, and they should go home at some point. I mean, when should they go home? It's difficult for me to set a date of expectations on this, but I do want to say that points have been made, points have been heard, and I've been to lots of different protests in Manitoba. Observed them, not been a protester necessarily. I've heard many concerns from different people that I didn't always agree with, but you try to listen and go, what is it in that disagreement that we might be able to find some commonality and some common ground. So I'm not going to put a date on, when I think somebody should go or somebody shouldn't go. I'm glad that there's been some improvement in terms of, the noise, so that residents in the area can go about and properly live their life. And I think that there is still reasonable traffic flow, which is also important. That hasn't happened in some places like Ottawa. So I'm glad for that. And I think that, the communication that's happening between the protesters and the Winnipeg Police Service is having some dividends. And I'm glad that both of them are doing that.
From CBC Radio Canada and Charlotte.
Hi, I'd like to know if the province has been in contact with the federal government regarding what's happening at the border right now, and if we can expect measures to be taken by the federal government.
So I was in cabinet meetings this morning. I have reached out to Minister Mendicino, reached out to my colleague on the U.S.-Canada Relations Committee, Speaker Robert Cupp of the Ohio House in Ohio Senate in Ohio. I know that the Premier has been in contact with the mayor today and regularly. I've been in contact with Marcus Chambers, who's the chair of the Winnipeg Police Services Board. So there has been, significant contact, and I know that there'll continue to be contact, and we've offered what assistance we can in terms of resources, recognizing that operationally this is a police matter.
And what the province can do to limit the impact of what's happening right now?
Well, I mean, when it comes to the border itself, of course, the border is federally managed. It'll be a joint operation between the RCMP and the Canadian Border Services because there's shared jurisdiction there. But, we will continue to offer the assistance that we can. But I do think that there needs to be that ability nationally to begin some discussion that tries to unify and bring Canadians back together, not in complete agreement, but also not believing that that some people are less Canadian or haven't been contributors to our Canadian society in the past or won't be in the future, because they will, and we're all going to have to live together at some point again. And the more that we can understand that now, I think the easier that's going to be.
From CBC Manitoba, Marina.
Good afternoon, Minister. You say the federal government needs to engage with protesters. We have repeatedly asked if the Premier or any ministers have been in touch with the ones that are here in Manitoba. Have you or any senior government officials been in direct conversation with the protesters, either at the legislature, at the school, or at the border?
So my call is for the federal government to start, first of all, bringing down the temperature, start to engage with what some of the concerns are and how they can be worked through. The federal government will determine, those are the goals. Those have to be the objectives. How that's achieved is something that they'll determine. I believe that a letter from the demonstrators went to the Premier yesterday in terms of the request for a meeting. I imagine that that's still in consideration at this point. But the communications has been quite good between the Winnipeg Police Service and the demonstration, which has, I think, been positive and hasn't always been the case in other places.
So to date, have any senior government officials been in direct conversation with the protesters? So
the letter, I think, was received yesterday by government, and there'll be consideration about communications. Communication's been good between the Winnipeg Police Service and the demonstrators, and I think any other sort of contact has just been requested very recently.
From the Globe and Mail, Carrie.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. Minister, you talked about how you want the Trudeau government to engage with protesters, to bring down the temperature, to engage with their concerns. Are you suggesting that the federal government negotiate with protesters?
No, what I've said is I think that they need to engage in this issue, and there are different ways, to do that. We as a government, the provincial government in Manitoba, early on when it came to the vaccine mandates, said that there should be an examination of what other options that there are. And that engagement isn't, it's not for me to say whether or not how the federal government reaches that objective in terms of trying to ensure that the temperature comes down, trying to find a way to manage our way through an issue and keep those borders open. But engagement can take a lot of different forms. Sometimes it's just engaging the issue to go, how is it that we can come to a different solution, and keeping those borders open and trying to address some of the concerns that exist. So again, engagement isn't always about face-to-face discussions. It can happen in lots of different ways, but the federal government has to engage in a way to get to that point.
Minister, taking all that, it sounds as though you're placing all of this on the idea that the protests are based on the on the cross-border vaccine mandate for truckers. People are protesting provincial mandates and federal, but largely it all comes back to provincial. What is your government doing, and why then do you bump all of this on the Trudeau government when provincial mandates are key.
Yeah, I don't think that I bumped it all on the Trudeau government. Certainly when it comes to the international border, that is a federal responsibility. And so I think that a lot of the protests started as a result of a vaccine mandate across the international border that we indicated early on could be problematic, both from a supply chain issue and other issues. But regardless, that there should be some engagement to see if there are other ways, like Manitoba did, to try to achieve what the goals were. If you only go in with one solution, then you usually only come out with one outcome. So that was our hope early on. When it comes to provincial mandates in Manitoba, you will likely know that the provincial government reduced restrictions on Tuesday of this week, I believe it was. Dr. Roussin, our Chief Provincial Public Health Officer in Manitoba, indicated that he believed that all restrictions could be lifted by spring, which I guess spring starts in a few weeks. And I think you'll hear more details about that tomorrow.
From CTV National News, Jill.
Good afternoon, Minister Goertzen. I'm actually in Emerson, and these protesters have porta potties and trailers and campers, and it looks like they're going to be here for the long haul. How much time does Manitoba have here? This is a border where 1,000 trucks pass every day.
Yeah, thanks, Jill. And I haven't seen the details that you're seeing on the scene there, but I am concerned that this is going to go on a long time and in a way that it's going to have reputational damage to Manitoba and to Canada. That's going to have economic damage. I can tell you in my role on the Canada-U.S. Relations Committee over a decade, done a lot of work in terms of trying to ensure that border, I don't mean just at Emerson, I mean throughout Canada, remains active and open, doing things on pre-clearance and a lot of different things to ensure that our business partners in the United States, so we can continue to trade. And you will know that there are some in the United States who don't want to have free and open trade on everything when it comes to Canadians and the work that we do. And we can't be giving them reasons to make their case that we're not a reliable partner. That's putting on my role in the International Relations Committee together with Senator Cupp in Ohio. So it can't go on for a long time. We need to be able to ensure that the border is open. Doesn't mean there can't be demonstrations and people can't make their points, but we have to allow those truckers to be able to get goods into the United States and others to come back.
All right, and you've also mentioned multiple times the public health announcement coming tomorrow. These people are not leaving until the mandates end. Is this something they're going to want to watch tomorrow?
I think every time our Premier speaks, people should watch.
Oh, my goodness. Okay, thank you.
We now return to the News Conference Theatre.
It does sound like you're putting a lot of the weight here on the federal government. And the protesters here want the province to remove all mandates immediately. We saw some of their earlier demands at the start of this protest outside the legislature. They want Roussin fired, some of them. They're making these requests, and you seem to be suggesting that there's some halfway point that might appease them. What do you think the province should do?
So I think you're probably conflating two different things, Steve. So there's the protest is happening at the U.S.-Canadian border, which clearly is essentially a federal responsibility because it's a Canada-U.S. border. And it was largely started as a result of the vaccine mandate, which our province early on said that we should be looking at other alternatives because there could be negative consequences to otherwise. I'm not sure that people are imagining this, but there was certainly indicated early on that should be reconsidered. When it comes to mandates in the province, I mean, it's been indicated that decisions are going to be made based on the health situation in Manitoba. That will be the deciding factor in terms of how decisions are made, and that's how it should be. I mean, at some point, we will be without mandates and we'll be without restrictions. And I suspect that there might be some people who say, well, hang on now, we think we should have some, and maybe they'll protest for restrictions. But on either side, the decision has to be made based on evidence. And the evidence that we're seeing right now is that we're certainly on the better side of the Omicron wave. Dr. Roussin indicated, well, I think it was several weeks ago, it feels like several weeks ago, but before there was a protest, I believe, that he believed the restrictions could be able to be lifted by spring, and we're fast approaching spring. And so to the extent that there have been concerns about restrictions or mandates, we're clearly moving in the right direction. The speed at which that direction is moved in will be determined by the evidence that we have, and you'll hear more about that, I think, tomorrow.
The government used to, I understand that there was a different premier at the time, but a few years ago this government expressed alarm at railway blockades and temporary highway blockade over Indigenous issues. And a bill was brought forward to allow for the quick removal of any obstruction of critical infrastructure. That bill was withdrawn. It comes across now that the government is sounding less concerned with an immediate resolution to these blockades that we're seeing now.
Well, I'm not sure that they're always analogous, right? So if you're talking about, blockading, and I don't remember exactly all the details, I do remember in general situation, but if you're talking about blockading a railroad where a train can't pass, that feels a little different than on what's happening on Broadway where cars are still moving. But I mean, if the border is entirely closed, and there aren't the ability to move any goods across, which I don't think is the situation today. That's not what I've heard. I understood that because I was asking particularly about livestock. I understood that those livestock trucks were still going through the border, but clearly an entire shutdown of the border at some point would result in other action, I would believe.
This will be the last question.
I'm wondering, Minister, you mentioned that tomorrow there'll be an announcement or some information given by the Premier and Dr. Roussin on the public health restrictions. I'm not sure what they're going to say, but are you worried that some people might look at what's happening with this protest and think anything that's announced might be a response to that and not a response to the actual science and data that we're seeing related to the
They might have if Dr. Roussin hadn't been out a few weeks ago, and it already clearly indicated the direction that Manitoba was happening, and I believe it was before there was any issues up front of the legislature. So he gave a very clear indication at that time when he was out with the Premier where he believed things were going based on the evidence. I think what you're seeing now in terms of other evidence, that's continuing on. I'll let him speak about the details of that. But I think it's really, really important to remember, because that's a very, very good question, Joss, that Dr. Roussin sat at this table and indicated that he believed that restrictions and mandates could be lifted by spring, which we're getting close to, if we continued on that path. So I think that he'll determine whether or not we're still on that path in the announcement that he and the Premier have, and I look forward to hearing that as well. But remember that announcement predated what you're seeing outside, I believe.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Good to see you all again.